Homebrew mechanics can be a lot of fun, but they can also be a royal headache. In this video, we're going to discuss why homebrew rules often suck, and I'll give you a simple checklist to avoid the worst of the pitfalls. Hey friends, my name is Timothy, though some people do call me Tim. I am a professional dungeon master, and here on my channel I help you improve your game of Dungeons and Dragons. Let's get to it. When talking about custom mechanics, there is a lot of ground to cover. Dungeons & Dragons is essentially a sandbox in a lot of ways, and we love tinkering with our toys. Today, we're primarily talking about the concept of homebrew rules like spells, items, magical items, abilities, feats, but we're not going to dive too far into the nitty-gritty of any specific section. We're probably going to have to unpack those separately at some other time. Monsters, for instance, are their whole own ball of wax. The biggest question that I think people forget to ask when they are creating homebrew is the question, do you need it? So often, a simple reflavoring of a magic item, a spell, or other ability can have the same end result as creating something laboriously from scratch. If you don't believe me, try scrolling sometime through the 6,229 pages of custom spells on D&D Beyond. Aside from the fact that you're going to find a lot of recreations of the exact same thing, you're also going to see a lot of patterns where people are essentially creating things that have already been created somewhere in the rules. Even if what you are trying to create does not already exist and truly does need to be homebrewed into the game in order for you to include it. Time spent thinking about what might replace that if you weren't able to create this new rule. What might already exist is time well spent. It'll help you hone in the creation that you eventually come out with. Let's go to my office and talk about that. All right, let's address the dirty B word in the room. Balance. When you're talking about power and homebrew, it's very easy to go too far in one or the other direction. Too weak, and we create something that our players have no real interest in interacting with. We spend all this time crafting this cool magical item with all these fun features and differences and nuances. It's something unique and wonderful that doesn't exist in the game at all, but ultimately, if it's not intriguing enough to actually make them want to use it, then it's just so much wasted time. Alternatively, if we create this mega powerful magical item that hits above the pay grade that perhaps we were aiming for, then we're going to find the arms race grows quite wild as people constantly try to find new ways to turn everything into a nail because of the massive hammer that we have handed to them. We don't want to go too far in either direction. What we want is a nice middle road balancing act, walking the wire, that allows us to intrigue our players and give them new, fun, awesome options that they're going to enjoy, while at the same time not overdoing it and giving something that becomes the new must-have, only decent option and removes a bunch of choices from the player because of the virality of this particular object, item, rule, etc. Basically, any time that you have created a rule that becomes the new must-have, you have essentially made that option so much better than all the other choices that the other choices wash away. You're not just adding a new option to the table, what you're doing is taking away all of the other options by making them just not as good. Obviously, your players' mindsets and focus upon the rules and mechanics is going to wildly make changes on that, but it's just an undesirable situation that we don't want to get into with that subset of our players that are going to interact with it that way. So, balance is the goal. But how do we achieve that? There are a couple of good questions to ask yourself when it comes to trying to make sure if something is balanced or if it's outside the box. You might have already guessed it, but the first is again to check the existing rules. To go back to our step one and decide, hey, does this thing that I'm coming up with fit in line with a rule that's already in place? Is it similar to a spell? Has it got the same kinds of numbers involved? There's also sections in the Dungeon Master's Guide on creating these items that will help you to determine whether or not something is too powerful or not powerful enough, at least by the raw numbers of the bounded accuracy system. In honesty, that's one of the things that 5th edition does best. Because we have a baseline of power, we know when we are going above or below it, and that's a very useful piece of information. One of the other means that we can utilize in order to determine whether or not something is too powerful or too weak is to play test it. Naturally, this is one of the powerhouse reasons why big companies like Wizards of the the coast are able to produce content in such a fashion that they have a reasonable confidence, at least, that what they're putting out is not going to completely break the game. And even them, with the massive budget of time, talent, and eyes that they have compared to what we've got available, still come out with spells that have everybody scratching their head and wondering how Wizards didn't see that this new spell that they brought out was completely cancerous and nearly required by everybody who was capable of casting it. Yes, Silvery Barbs, I'm looking at you. Since playtesting is a luxury that most of us really don't have, we have to come up with creative ways to playtest our solutions. Obviously, it's possible for us to put something into our game live, let it run, and then, if we want, we could rewind the situation or find some excuse to remove that thing from the game. This is possible, but not desirable. Once we put something out into the world for our players, typically they're going to want to continue to have that object permanence, that they know that it is still there, and there are few things more likely to upset players than taking away toys. With a frank discussion, we can go this route and it can work, it's just not our desired option. And even if you have created a balanced rule, you're really not going to know until it hits the sniff test of actual play. However, one hack that you can use in order to play test an item is to know your players. If you know your players and you know the player who is most likely to optimize their character, then that player is your playtest. Show them this new rule that you're working on and ask them to create a build around it, to utilize it to its absolute utmost potential, and then to tell you whether or not it's a powerful rule or not. Take a look at what they do with your rule, and if it looks like it's outrageous, that's because it is. And your player will be able to tell you that better than you might be able to on your own. Even if you're that kind of player, we have an innate bias towards those things that we create. When it comes time to build a new rule, a simple checklist of questions to ask ourselves can help us to avoid creating something that we shouldn't have spent all the time and effort bringing into existence. I have those arranged for you in a Notion template. Let's sit down and go through the list together. All right. What questions do we need to ask in order to make sure that our homebrew doesn't suck? In the description down below, you'll find a detailed Notion checklist that will help you run through this. Why do you need to create this new rule? If you don't have a particularly compelling why as to why the rule should be created, and for most people that's going to mean a reason more than, man, this sounds like fun, then it's probably not something that is going to add enough to your game to be worth the effort put in. What does it do that no other rule already does? Nobody likes to reinvent the wheel, and there is no reason to create a rule that is unnecessary. If there's already a rule that does this and you're simply trying to make something that perhaps does it better, you are usually on a slippery slope down towards a overpowered rule that is unnecessary to the game. If you don't create this rule, is there another way to accomplish the goal that you were seeking to do? If there's already a way to accomplish what you're looking to do, again, you don't need this rule in order to be able to reach that point. A lot of the time we end up creating homebrew because we want to overcome the limitations that are between us and what we want to accomplish. Oftentimes, the challenges that are built into that have been carefully play tested and crafted. What is the closest rule to this one that we could base the numbers on? By finding a rule that is adjacent and close to the rules that we are creating, we try to put ourselves into a tighter space when it comes to the numbers so that we don't stray too far outside of the lines of the accuracy of the system. Can you think of any way to abuse this rule? If something comes immediately to mind, there's probably a problem. If it takes you a little bit, then perhaps it could or could not be a problem. Putting it in front of another of your players, like we talked about before, is a great way to give it the litmus test, and ultimately our goal should be that it is hard to abuse any rule that we create. Along those lines, an easy way to answer whether or not a rule would be abusable is to ask the question, would you use this rule at every opportunity? If the answer is yes, that you would use this rule every single round, every single opportunity, every time the situation came up, the homebrew is probably too powerful. However, on the flip side, if you can't see yourself using this rule except in incredibly niche circumstances, then it's probably an unnecessary rule also, or perhaps too weak? Finally, does this rule add sufficient depth to make up for the additional complexity that creating new rules adds? Every time that we create a new item or put something else into the world, we are essentially saying that this adds enough depth to the gameplay experience, whether on a mechanical or a story front, that it is worth the added complication of memorizing another piece of information, writing an additional item line down, and referring to it in order to be able to run the game. The less that we create, the less complex our game. But conversely, the less complexity in our game, the less depth. What we're looking for, ideally, is a high depth to complexity ratio. Simple rules and mechanics that can be used in interesting ways and build the story in the process. Since you're obviously interested in improving your game and leveling up your experience, this playlist up here is exactly what you need. Hopefully these questions and the others in the Notion template will be of use to you as you create some awesome homebrew, so that we don't have to have 6,000 pages of it at our home tables just like they have on D&D Beyond. Thanks for watching.